All right, we've now got part 3 out of the way. Whew, all of that complicated math. Oh, there was nothing bad about it. Let's go ahead and come over here on our overview implementation plan and mark part 3 off, and let's turn our attention to part 4. Good news is part 4 is going to give you a bit of a reprieve. It's going to be a little bit shorter than the other parts so far. All we need to do this time around is create the player, get the controller input working so that we can control the player, and then of course make sure that screen blocking is in place so that the player does not accidentally get controlled right off the screen. So let's go ahead and take just a second and look at what is required to pull this off. Let's go ahead and jump on up here to the top and add in a new white screen and get started. So here we are, part 4. So starting out with, let's go ahead and create a few more constants, so a few new fields that we're going to be adding in. Again, I said we're going to be sprinkling in new members here and there when they are necessary for something specific. And in this case, well, we need to be able to control a player going slow, a player going fast, and, well, we need the player too. So let's go ahead and create 2 constants. And these 2 constants will represent the slow speed for the player and the fast speed for the player, because back in the original requirements we talked about the player is going to go at only 2 speeds, rather fast or slow.
Right, and putting these as constants up at the top of the game class will allow these to be used basically as game properties, so that later if you need to adjust some part of gameplay, like the player speed here, we'll have the values presented in a very easy to access place within the code.
Exactly. So we'll set the slow speed up to something like 5.0, and we'll come in here and set up a float called player, if I can get that written. There we go. So player speed fast. And we'll just double it. So we'll say 10.0. Okay. So now we have a slow speed of 5, a fast speed of 10. Now let's go ahead and set up a field for the player.
And the reason we're going to do this is when we're looking through actors and updating them, we're going to have to deal with things that are other than the player. Now, some of those things will have to interact, so we need to have one reference to some item, maybe a relevant item like an enemy, but we'll also need a reference to the player so that we can compare them and do things like collision checks. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold a field in the game that is always holding a reference to the player, so that no matter what checks we need to do, the player is always available for us to check against.
Exactly. After this, we're then going to turn our attention over to load graphics content. Let me go ahead and jot that down. Load graphics content. And inside of load graphics content, what we're going to do is get the player created.
This can almost be viewed as a temporary creation, since in the end we're going to have methods to handle the creation of everything, including the player.
Right.
But those methods don't exist yet, so for the time being we're going to kick everything off from load graphics content.
Exactly. I mean, because after all, by the end of this part, we want to have a player that we can control moving around the screen, which means at some point we're going to need to create that player. Now, once this is out of the way, it's time to turn the rest of our attention over to the update method in the game class. Let's go ahead and jot that down. So inside update, what we're going to do is we are going to look for the player.
Because if you remember to the loop we added inside of update, that was a loop that would walk through each actor individually.
Exactly.
Now, what we mean by look for is those actors may be of different actual types, meaning one of the actors might be a player, some of the other actors might be cells. So we need to look through those actors and determine if the specific actor that we're looking at in this iteration of the loop is in fact the player actor.
Exactly.
And if it is, then there's specific player things that we need to do to it.
And here we go. So if actor is player, then do the following block of code, and this is where we're going to put in things like handling movement based off of your controller and making sure the player can't move outside of our screen bounds. So once we get done with all of that, since we're inside of a loop, there's no reason for us to continue walking through the checks to see if it was a cell or an enemy or anything else, so we will simply just continue. Meaning we're now ready to jump through. All right, or basically just continue on out of this. So let's see, go in for a player. I guess I just said it a second ago. I'll just go ahead and throw this down. What we need to do is make sure that we get the input. Of course, we've already set it up so that we've got the gamepad state, but we need to make sure that it's normalized. So I'm just going to write down normalize.
There's probably a few other things that we'll need to look at, possibly reversing the thumbstick.
Yeah.
So that it works properly in screen space. And then, of course, we're going to want to turn on and normalize that. And the reason for the normalization is because we want a digital style of speed. We don't want the analog variable speed that a thumbstick would normally give. We want to normalize that to 1 so that we always move at a constant speed in any given direction. And once we have the movement itself set up, the player isn't constrained to anything. That means it can move directly off the screen and get lost off in space. So what we want to do is do an additional check on the player's position and make sure that the position is on screen. And if not, lock it back to being on screen. So that will effectively block the player from leaving the screen.
Exactly. And once again, we're going to be doing a lot of this stuff if the actor that we're dealing with, of course, is a player. And that's it. So by the end of Part 4, we should be able to pick up our controller, launch the application, and control our player running around the screen. So with that, let's go ahead and jump on over to Visual Studio and get this part coded in.